Hello and welcome to Chanakyaa's Face Off. In this fast moving technological world, there are certain innovations which really touch our day to day lives. One such innovation of the 20th century that has touched almost every one of our lives is the email. And today, we have with us a proud son of Bharat from the state of Tamil Nadu and the inventor of email, Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. I take great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Shiva to Chanakya's Face Off. Welcome, Dr. Shiva.
Welcome, Amala. How are you?
I'm good, sir. Thank you. How are you?
Good.
Great. I want to begin this with your most favorite topic of email and being the innovator of email. The world knows that you invented email as a 14-year-old boy. But looking back at your life, which would you call more challenging, the innovation or your journey to prove to the world that you are the innovator?
Well, I don't think it's about proving to the world. The facts are black and white on who invented email. It was invented by a 14-year-old brown immigrant kid in Newark, New Jersey. The challenge really here is a much larger one, which is to break people away from the brainwashing that all great innovations must come from the military industrial academic complex, that you have to go to MIT or you have to go to Harvard or you have to go to these big institutions. So the de-brainwashing that needs to take place is to recognize that innovation occurs anytime, any place, by anybody. Now, in my case, I have been in both worlds. Email was invented in 1978 by a 14-year-old brown-skinned immigrant kid in Newark, New Jersey. And think about what I'm talking about here. A 14-year-old kid, number one. Number two, it occurred when I just stepped off the plane from India, 7 years before I came to the United States from India in 1970. I invented email in 1978, and that 7 or 8 years. And then it occurred in Newark, New Jersey, which is one of the poorest cities in the United States and a small medical college. So I had the opportunity to do innovative work there. But then I went to MIT where I did other innovative work, the invention of EchoMail, Cytosolve, many other things. So, but it doesn't mean that you have to go to a place like MIT to innovate. And this has been the brainwashing that's been done, that you create these centers of innovation, like you somehow farm, like genetically engineered foods, innovation in one place. And then when you go there, then you get to be an innovator. The wonderful story with the invention of email is that it's not even, there's no dispute even. There's not even a gray area. I was the first to convert the entire interoffice mail system. It's very important to understand. We're not talking about the simple exchange of text messages or electronic messaging, which dates back to Samuel Morse. I'm talking about taking the entire system, which was in those days in the 1970s or even beyond, the entire interoffice paper-based mail system, the inbox, the outbox, the folders, the entire desktop, the blind carbon copy, the carbon paper, the folders, return receipt, attachments, all of that entire system, and port it to the electronic version, which is what I did. It was a system of interlocking parts. I named that system email as a 14-year-old kid, term no one ever used. But most importantly, I converted that entire physical system to the electronic version and in 50,000 lines of Fortran code. And then I also ended up getting the first United States copyright recognizing me as the official inventor of email, because in 1980, the Copyright Act of 1980 was passed, which allowed you to use copyright law to protect software patents. The Supreme Court was not really recognizing software patents until 1994. So named it email, wrote all the code to create email, and have the first US copyright, officially recognizing him as the inventor of email. So there's no dispute there. The interesting thing is, why was there a controversy even created? That's really the fundamental question here.
Yes.
That's a question. If my color was white and I had blonde hair and blue eyes and my name was, John Mountbatten, right? There would be no dispute. In fact, you could argue that in I won many awards for it. It was in the local newspaper, but it would have been projected farther. And, from an Indian background, people are always taught, unfortunately, to be overly humble, and you're not taught to promote your work and to get credit for what you did, which I think is very, very important. I think credit is extremely important. And the reason credit is important is not for ego, because it actually shows where the origin of things come from. And in this case, the origin of the invention of email comes from a triangle of not the military, big industry, or big academia. It comes from a very different triangle. That triangle was a loving family who was very supportive, infrastructure, and a mentor that I was able to get at Rutgers Medical School, was in Newark, New Jersey, and other dedicated teachers. So that's the real breeding ground for innovation. So you have all these organizations, be it in India or the United States, which put billions into some one local area of IIT or MIT or in Kendall Square or Silicon Valley, and they're really trying to genetically engineer innovation. And it's frankly not working. If you look at it, over the last 100 years, last 50 years, there hasn't been any major innovations. Everything you see is incremental stuff. Most of the stuff that takes place in India is copying what occurs here, be it Flipkart or be it any of these things. And the reason there's no fundamental innovation occurring is because we're not supporting the infrastructure broadly everywhere so every child can participate in this innovation. By the way, I just want to remind everyone that it was a 14-year-old boy who invented TV. His name is Philo Farnsworth. He didn't have to deal with the race issue that I had to deal with, but he did have to deal with many of the other things. He was a young kid. He invented TV, he saw how the cows did the Z pattern, and he created it in a small town in Franklin, Idaho. But he had the same ingredients to support a family, some infrastructure, and some mentors. You see? It took him 60 years to get recognition. For the first 20 years, a very large company stole his invention and started manufacturing it. It was only 19 years later was he able to defeat them and win, in a lawsuit. But he only had 1 year patent life left because patent life is only for 20 years. So there are many, many stories like this of innovation occurring outside the bounds of someone going to Harvard and dropping out, right? Or going to MIT. And that's what the real challenge is. So the challenge is not for me to prove anything, because when people look at the facts, it's obvious. The challenge is to unbrainwash people. And for the Indians watching, it's particularly Indians need to get over their own white supremacy. What is white supremacy?
I was about to ask the same in a different tone, though, because I've heard from a lot of immigrants coming to the United States. I'm an immigrant as well. That America is a land of opportunity where you don't have these social inequalities, which you otherwise face in a country, in a developing country like India. So, but hearing your story, am I to think otherwise?
Well, here's the deal. When I was in India, my mother was a very young child. I remember this. She said, when we're getting ready to leave for the United States, she said, in India, you can be discriminated 9 different ways. In the United States, you can be discriminated 3 different ways. So in the United States, you can be discriminated by the color of your skin, what part of the India you grew up in, the language, right? Caste, whether you're male or female, right? And so on. There's about 9 different ways, right? In the United States, maybe 3 different ways. So in that sense, there's an advantage here. But the reality is the United States is becoming more, well, in India, you also have the caste system, right? And we should talk about that because many Indians do not want to talk about it. And I think it's important to talk about it. And when they do talk about it, the people who talk about it are intellectuals, pseudo-intellectuals, and they don't really get to the heart of it. The reality is there's a global caste system now developing where it is based on what clique you hang out with. And based on that, you're deemed to be of a certain strata. And you may not even have any talent. So a lot of very wealthy, dumb kids are getting into major institutions in college, and very poor, smart kids aren't. So you have that phenomenon taking place. But when you go back to really look at this wonderful story of the invention of email, you realize that many of the people who fail to understand the invention of email are, when I look at the white working class conservatives in the United States, they get it. In fact, the toughest people who have a problem getting it are sometimes the Indians in India. And typically, Indians in India who themselves have a racist attitude. And we have to talk about this. The British subjugation of India took place for 300-400 years. And the white supremacy that got embedded into people, and we have to use this word, white supremacy. And why do we have to use this word? Because the word was actually created by the elites in places like Harvard and Oxford to call poor white people white supremacists. This is what's interesting. The white supremacists, the true white supremacists in places like Oxford and Harvard, who are the elites, and by the way, you don't have to be white to be a white supremacist. A lot of them are in India too, who believe that all great things come from white people. And in fact, in the middle of when the controversy developed in 2011, some of you may know, when I never spoke about the invention of email, never really made money off of it. But in 2012, all of my materials went into the Smithsonian. My dear mom was dying of a horrible disease in 2011 called pulmonary fibrosis. And in a suitcase, she had saved everything, all the artifacts, all the proof, everything. There's, all the evidence and the tapes, the computer program, the copyright. And the Smithsonian National Museum of American History honored me on February 16th, 2012, 3 months after my mom had passed. In fact, after a month after my mom had passed away, which is actually tomorrow, January 7th. They accepted all my materials. They had a huge ceremony. And on February 16th, the Washington Post reporter, 2012, wrote a beautiful article saying Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai honored as the inventor of email. And all of these materials went into the Smithsonian. Well, it should have been an occasion for celebration. But a white academic by the name of Thomas Haig, who considers himself a glorious historian when he really isn't, to him, this was massive jealousy that came upon him when this was like a new skull was found in Africa. He had already written a story that a white guy who looked like a nerd had created email, who was working for a defense company called Raytheon. And when this went into the Smithsonian, the stories that came out, this guy called me a fraud. Some people called me an asshole. Some people said this curry-stained Indian should be beaten and hanged. This is in 2012. Okay? Now, if this had happened to a Jewish fellow or to somebody else, the Jewish community would have been in uproar. The Indian community stayed silent, and therein is the problem. So you have someone saying this curry-stained Indian should be beaten and hanged for the rightful credit that was due to me, and as great honor took place. You have this white historian attacking me because he is connected with the military-industrial complex at Raytheon, who creates histories. And they had found this guy who has glasses and it looked like he's a nerd, when all he did was write 15 minutes of software code to use other people's stuff to add text to a bottom of a file. At best, it was a caveman version of Reddit, okay? You could say it was a rudimentary version of Facebook. It wasn't email, and he knew he didn't create email. And it's well known he knew he didn't create email. But Raytheon, a defense company, had used the @ symbol because they were entering the cybersecurity market in 2007. And they used him as their brand ambassador to say they invented email, and they know it was a lie. By the way, Raytheon is a defense company whose CEO at the time had written a book on integrity, and the book was completely found to be plagiarized. So Raytheon has a history of stealing other people's inventions. So 2012, when this occurred, and you have this massive racist abuse taking place, and I was teaching a class at MIT while running a company, one of the most popular classes, thousands of calls came in saying that I should be fired. How dare this Indian guy, this brown-skinned Indian guy, say that he invented email? Again, no Indian said anything, because Indians are brainwashed to think that all great inventions must come from white people. This has to be talked about. In fact, Indians are the biggest racists. And this also has to be talked about. They're racist towards themselves. India has the biggest consumer product in India is skin whitening solution, more than Coke or Pepsi. So we have to have a discussion about that. And we have not even scratched the surface about that discussion, because the subjugation that took place in India starting in 1757 with the Battle of Plassey, when India became occupied, was never resolved in 1947. Because what Gandhi really did was he White men with crowns left India and brown men with white hats took over India. India never really had a good nationalist revolutionary movement, which elevated the integrity and the nationalism of Indians to have some pride for themselves. So Indians have never had that. So it gets even more interesting in 2014, in the middle of this manufactured controversy. Walter Isaacson, and everyone should look him up, he's a biographer who wrote Steve Jobs' book. He is known as the liberal elite as you can get, a white liberal elite who started Aspen Institute, and I think was with CNN, or people can look it up, a major publisher. He writes a book in the middle of this controversy called Innovators of the Digital Revolution. Innovators of the Digital Revolution, a big book.
And email was not mentioned. I remember.
Oh, it gets even worse. Every person who's mentioned, and there's a white person, in fact, a white woman. And everyone should look at the pictures. He's got chapters for Bill Gates, Sergey Brin. He leaves out email in the middle of this raving controversy created by these racist historians. And everyone should go through that book. So you have no one of color in that book, no yellow person, no red person, no brown person. This is white supremacy. And where does white supremacy come from? White supremacy is not coming from everyday working class white people. It is coming from people at Harvard. It is coming from people at Yale. It is coming from people at Oxford. And it's coming from people, Indians, who go to Oxford. Because these people are brainwashed over a period of 300-400 years to thinking that all great things must come from white people. And those people, what's fascinating in the United States is those people, the elites, call poor working people in the United States who want to protect the First Amendment, who want to support free speech, they call them white supremacists. And this is where the interesting deception and insidiousness is. So I just did a talk on, if someone looks at that picture of that brown-skinned kid with email in the background and immediately gets uncomfortable about that, black, white, yellow, otherwise, you are a white supremacist. And so the real challenge here is to unbrainwash people, to have people have a sense of self-respect, and to recognize that credit does matter. I didn't care about the credit of email, but when I saw the vitriol and what took place when this went into the Smithsonian is when I realized, every human being on this planet is going to know the inventor of email, and it was a brown-skinned 14-year-old kid named Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. And why is that important? It's not for my ego. It's because it's about a very fundamental truth. And that truth is whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Hindu, whatever religion you are, ultimately the expression of one's creativity is the divine work. And if you're saying only these people can invent, because when I went to MIT, starting in 81, I was on the front page of MIT for inventing many things. Echo Mail, Fulbright Scholar. So I was a brown guy who MIT loved putting on the front page because I'm the model minority. But when the invention of email, the facts come out that email was done before MIT, the military-industrial complex has a problem with that. You say? So that's why the story of the invention of email, every Indian listening, get over your own racism, get over your own white supremacy, and you need to put yourself in the mirror and think about this. Why is it you do not know who the inventor of email is? And what is it in you that has a problem fully embracing that? And if you do, what does that mean for your children? If you're brown or you're non-white, do you even have any symbol of an innovator? Well, if you tell your young child, here's a symbol of an innovator, who is it? Well, it's going to be Thomas Alva Edison or Einstein or blah, blah, blah. And that is why the truth about the facts of a 14-year-old brown-skinned Indian immigrant kid inventing email is extremely important. It's important on so many dimensions, on just a factual basis, the psychological basis, the emotional basis, the financial basis, on many, many levels. And it's time that everyone in India knew this. And it's time that everyone knew this. It's not just only Indian, because Philo Farnsworth created TV before outside of the military-industrial complex. he didn't have, again, as I mentioned, he didn't have to deal with the race issue. So it's really about who is determining who's an innovator, who's intelligent, and who isn't. And you'll find out it's a small set of people sitting down the street at Harvard University or across the ocean over at Oxford. And they've been doing this for far too long, and it needs to end.